Hey guys, Miss Ebert here. Today I'm going to be reading Chapter 7 and 8 of Mr. Popper's Penguins. Before I get started, I just wanted to give a shout out to my students, Billy, Cameron, Nathaniel, Gareth, Jerome, Dylan, and Jalea. I miss you guys so much and I can't wait until we can be back in school together. So here is Chapter 7, Captain Cook Builds a Nest. Very reluctantly, Janie and Bill had to leave Captain Cook and go to school. Mrs. Popper was busy in the kitchen rather belatedly doing the breakfast dishes, and while she dimly realized that the penguin was going in and out of the refrigerator pretty frequently, she thought nothing of it at first. Meanwhile, Mr. Popper had abandoned his telephoning and was now busy shaving and making himself neat in honor of being the owner of such a splendid bird as Captain Cook. But the penguin, though thus neglected for the moment, was by no means idle. With the unusual excitement, and having to go to the market earlier than usual, Mrs. Popper had not yet gotten round to straightening the house. She was an excellent housekeeper. Still, with two children like Janie and Bill, and a husband with such untidy ways, there is no denying the fact that she had to pick up the place very frequently. Captain Cook was now attending to the picking up. In the corners of every room, he prowled and poked and pecked with a busy thoroughness. Into every closet, he stared with his white circle eyes. Under and behind all the furniture, he crowded his plump figure with little subdued cries of curiosity, surprise, and pleasure. And each time he found what he seemed to be looking for, he picked it up in the black end of his red beak and carried it, waddling proudly on his wide pink feet, into the kitchen and into the icebox. At last it occurred to Mrs. Popper to wonder what on earth the busy little bird was up to. When she looked up, she could only scream to Mr. Popper to come quickly and see what Captain Cook had done now. Mr. Popper himself, looking rather remarkable, as Mrs. Popper noticed later, joining her in staring with astonishment into the refrigerator. Captain Cook came up too, and helped them look. "Ork, ork," he said with triumph. Mrs. Popper laughed, and Mr. Popper gasped as they saw the results of Captain Cook's trips through the house. They saw 2 spools of thread, 1 white chess bishop, and 6 parts of a jigsaw puzzle, a teaspoon and a closed box of safety matches, a radish, 2 pennies, a nickel, and a golf ball, 2 pencil stubs, 1 bent playing card, and a small ashtray, 5 hairpins, an olive, 2 dominoes, and a sock, a nail file, 4 buttons of various sizes, a telephone slug, 7 marbles, and a tiny doll's chair, 5 checker pieces, a bit of a graham cracker, a Parcheesi cup, and an eraser, a door key, a button hook, and a crumpled piece of tinfoil, half of a very old lemon, the head of a china doll, Mr. Popper's pipe, and a ginger ale cap, an ink bottle cork, 2 screws, and a belt buckle, 6 beads from a child's necklace, 5 building blocks, a darning egg, a bone, a small harmonica, and a partly consumed lollipop, 2 toothpaste lids, and a small red notebook. "Huh, I guess this is what you call the rookery," said Mr. Popper. "Only he couldn't find any stones to build his nest with." "Well," said Mrs. Popper, "those penguins may have heathen ways in the South Pole, but I declare I think this one is going to be quite a help around this house." "Ork," said Captain Cook. And strutting into the living room, he knocked over the best lamp. "I think, Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "that you better take Captain Cook outside for a little exercise." "Good gracious, but you're all dressed up. Why, you look almost like a penguin yourself." Mr. Popper had smoothed down his hair and shaved off all of his whiskers. Never again would Mrs. Popper have to reproach him for looking as wild as a lion. He had put on a white shirt with a white tie and a white flannel trousers, and a pair of bright tan oxblood shoes. He had gotten out of the cedar chest his old black evening tailcoat that he had been married in, and brushed it carefully, and put it on too. He did indeed look like a little penguin. He turned and strutted like one now for Mrs. Popper. But he did not forget his duty to Captain Cook. "Can I have a few yards of clothesline, please, Mamma?" asked Mr. Popper. Chapter 8. The Penguins' Promenade. Mr. Popper soon found that it was not so easy to take a penguin for a stroll. Captain Cook did not care at first for the idea of being put on a leash. However, Mr. Popper was firm He tied one end of the clothesline to the penguin's fat throat and the other to his own wrist. "Orc?" said Captain Cook, indignantly. Still, he was a very reasonable sort of bird, and when he saw that protesting did him no good, he recovered his customary dignity and decided to let Mr. Popper lead him. Mr. Popper put on his best Sunday derby and opened the front door with Captain Cook waddling graciously behind him. "Gaw?" said the penguin, stopping at the edge of the porch to look down at the steps. Mr. Popper gave him plenty of clothesline leash. "Glook," said Captain Cook, and raising his flippers, he leaned forward bravely and tobogganed down the steps on his stomach. Mr. Popper followed, though not in the same way. Captain Cook quickly got up to his feet again and strutted to the street ahead of Mr. Popper, with many quick turns of his head and pleased comments on the new scene. Down Proudfoot Avenue came a neighbor of the Poppers, Mrs. Calhoun. With her arms full of groceries, she stared in astonishment when she saw Captain Cook and Mr. Popper looking like a larger penguin himself in the black tailcoat. "Heavens have mercy on us!" she exclaimed, as the bird began to investigate the striped stockings under her house dress. "It isn't an owl, and it isn't a goose." "It isn't," said Mr. Popper, tipping his Sunday derby. "It's an Antarctic penguin, Mrs. Calhoun." "Get away from me," said Mrs. Calhoun to Captain Cook. "An anteater, is it?" No, not an anteater," exclaimed Mr. Popper. "Antarctic. It was sent to me from the South Pole." "Take your South Pole goose away from me at once," said Mrs. Calhoun. Mr. Popper pulled obediently at the clothesline, while Captain Cook took a parting peck at Miss Calhoun's striped stockings. "Heaven preserve us," said Mrs. Calhoun. "I must stop in and see Mrs. Popper at once. I would never have believed it. I will be going now." "So will I," said Mr. Popper, as Captain Cook dragged him off down the street. Their next stop was at the drugstore, at the corner of Proudfoot Avenue and Main Street. Here Captain Cook insisted on looking over the window display, which consisted of several open packages of shiny white boric crystals. These he evidently mistook for polar snow, for he began to peck at the window vigorously. Suddenly a car wheeled to the nearby curb with a shriek of its brakes, and two young men sprang out, one of them bearing a camera. "This must be it," said the first young man to the other. It's them, all right," said the second young man. The cameraman set up his tripod on the sidewalk. By this time a small crowd had gathered around, and two men in white coats had even come out of the drugstore to watch. Captain Cook, however, was still too much interested in the window exhibit to bother to turn around. You are Mr. Popper, of 432 Proudfoot Avenue, aren't you?" asked the second young man, pulling a notebook out of his pocket. "Yes," said Mr. Popper, realizing that his picture was about to be taken for the newspaper. The two young men had, as a matter of fact, heard about the strange bird from the policeman, and had been on their way to the Popper house to get an interview, when they saw Captain Cook. "Hey, Pelican, turn around and see the pretty birdie," said the photographer. "That's no pelican," said the other, who was a reporter. "Pelicans have a pouch in their bills." "I think it was a dodo, only dodos are extinct. This will make an elegant picture, if I can ever get her to turn around." "It's a penguin," said Mr. Popper proudly. "Its name is Captain Cook." "Glook," said the penguin, turning around now that they were talking about him. Spying the camera tripod, he walked over and examined it. "Probably thinks this is a three-legged stork," said the photographer. "This bird of yours," said the reporter, "is it a he or a she? The public will want to know." "Well," Mr. Popper hesitated. "Well, I call it Captain Cook." That makes it a he," said the reporter, writing rapidly in his little notebook. Still curious, Captain Cook started walking round and round the tripod, till the clothesline, the penguin, Mr. Popper, and the tripod were all tangled up. At the advice of one of the bystanders, the tangle was finally straightened out by Mr. Popper, walking around the tripod 3 times in the opposite direction. At last, Captain Cook, standing still beside Mr. Popper, consented to pose. Mr. Popper straightened his tie, and the cameraman snapped the picture. Captain Cook shut his eyes, and this is the way his picture appeared later in the newspaper. "One last question," said the reporter. "Where did you get your strange pet?" "From Admiral Drake, the South Pole explorer. He sent him up to me as a present." Yeah, said the reporter. Anyway, it's a good story. The two young men jumped into their car. Mr. Popper and Captain Cook continued their walk, with quite a crowd following and asking questions. The crowd was getting so thick that in order to escape, Mr. Popper led Captain Cook into the barber shop. Now, the man who kept the barber shop had, up to this time, been a very good friend of Mr. Popper's. Alright, that's all we have for today. Tune in tomorrow to hear some more. Bye!